It is the 12th of September, 1942, and somewhere beneath the cold grey surface of the North Atlantic, a U-boat releases its weapon. The torpedo slips from its tube with a mechanical shudder and begins its run. It does not leave a trail. There is no white froth cutting across the water's surface, no visible line betraying its path to the lookouts on the merchant vessel's bridge. The first officer sees nothing. The crew below hears nothing. And then the explosion tears through the hull amidships, and a ship that was carrying fuel oil to the besieged British war effort begins its final, irreversible descent. The U-boat commander, watching through his periscope, notes the kill in his log with professional satisfaction. His weapon had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had run straight, it had run deep, and it had run invisible. What made that torpedo different from anything Britain had deployed at the time was not its warhead, nor its speed, nor the skill of the man who fired it. It was the propulsion system hidden inside it, a system that burned a fuel mixture, leaving almost no trace in the water above. The Germans called it the G7E in its electric variant, and the broader family of weaponry it belonged to represented a leap in underwater warfare that the Royal Navy had not anticipated and could not, at that point, adequately counter. The tragedy, the particular painful irony, was that British engineers had understood the principle behind it years earlier. They had studied it, tested it, argued about it, and then set it aside. The decision made in 1938 had consequences that echoed across every Atlantic convoy lane for the better part of 4 years. This is the story of what happened when Royal Navy engineers finally got their hands on a German torpedo, took it apart, and found something they recognized. To understand why that recognition stung so deeply, it is necessary to step back to the years before the war and consider the problem that all naval engineers faced when designing an underwater weapon. The torpedo as a concept had been maturing since the 1860s, when Robert Whitehead produced his first self-propelled design in a workshop in Fiume. By the 1930s, the fundamental challenge remained what it had always been. You needed a propulsion source that was compact enough to fit inside a cylinder roughly 53 centimeters in diameter and roughly 7 meters in length, yet powerful enough to drive a weapon weighing close to a ton at speeds exceeding 30 knots across a range of several thousand meters, all whilst maintaining a precise running depth. The dominant British solution to this problem was compressed air, heated by burning alcohol. The Royal Navy's standard torpedo of the period used a combination of air, water, and fuel that, when burned together, drove a reciprocating engine. It was a capable system. It worked. But it had one characteristic that every torpedo designer treated as an unavoidable flaw. When the combustion products mixed with the residual air in the exhaust, they produced a trail of bubbles that rose to the surface and drew a perfectly visible line across the water between the torpedo's point of origin and its target. On a calm day, under good light, a lookout on an alert ship could see that wake and begin evasive action. The Germans called this the Blasenspur, the bubble trail. British torpedo designers knew it equally well. It was the defining vulnerability of the heat-driven torpedo, and the Royal Navy had lived with it for decades. The theoretical solution had existed for some time. An electric motor powered by a battery produced no combustion gases and therefore left no wake whatsoever. It was silent, invisible, and in principle straightforward. The problem was energy density. The batteries available in the 1930s could not store enough power to drive a torpedo at combat-useful speeds over combat-useful ranges, without making the weapon impractically large or impractically slow. British torpedo engineers at HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's torpedo school at Portsmouth, had run the numbers carefully and reached a conclusion that seemed, at the time, entirely rational. The performance gap between electric propulsion and thermal propulsion was simply too large. An electric torpedo would be slower. It would have shorter range. And in a service that measured torpedo performance against the backdrop of fleet versus fleet engagements, where ships moved fast and ranges were long, those deficiencies appeared decisive. The recommendation in 1938 was to continue development along thermal lines and defer electric propulsion indefinitely. The Germans had reached a different conclusion, and the difference between those two conclusions would cost lives. The G7E torpedo entered Kriegsmarine service in the late 1930s as a weapon that accepted the electric motor's limitations in exchange for its primary virtue. It was slower than the German thermal torpedo, the G7A, running at approximately 30 knots compared to 44. Its range at that speed was roughly 5,000 meters, against the 14,000 meters of the fastest thermal variant. But it left no wake, none whatsoever. And in the kind of war the Kriegsmarine was actually fighting, not fleet actions at long range in open water, but ambushes against slow merchant convoys at close quarters, often at night, often in poor visibility. Those limitations simply did not matter. The U-boat commander who fired a G7E at a freighter 600 meters away did not need 14,000 meters of range. He needed the target not to see the attack coming. The electric torpedo gave him that, and the performance trade-off, in the operational context of the Battle of the Atlantic, was essentially irrelevant. What made the G7E work where earlier electric torpedoes had failed was a combination of engineering decisions that together solved the battery problem with sufficient elegance. The weapon used a lead-acid accumulator, a battery design that, in modified form, could deliver the sustained current a torpedo motor required. The Germans had invested considerable effort in improving the specific energy output of these cells, packing them tightly into the rear section of the torpedo and designing the electric motor to operate at high efficiency across the required speed band. The motor itself was a two-shaft design driving contra-rotating propellers, which improved directional stability and reduced the torque reaction that had plagued earlier electric designs. The battery was preheated before deployment. Cold temperatures sharply reduced its performance, and the Germans addressed this by maintaining the weapons at a controlled temperature in the U-boat's torpedo compartment, sometimes using electric heating elements built into the storage racks. The entire rear section of the torpedo was, in engineering terms, densely conceived. The battery cells occupied roughly 40% of the weapon's total volume, arranged in two rows with the motor assembly between them. The weight was distributed carefully to achieve the correct running attitude. A torpedo that pitched even slightly during its run would deviate from its set depth, either passing beneath the target or, worse, broaching the surface. The contra-rotating propellers, each approximately 43 centimeters in diameter, turned at approximately 2,000 revolutions per minute during the attack run, producing a thrust that the German engineers had calculated was sufficient to maintain 30 knots against the drag of seawater at the design operating depth of between 2 and 8 meters. It is worth noting, with the candor these records deserve, that the G7E was not a perfect weapon. It was sensitive to temperature, and its performance degraded noticeably in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, particularly in winter. The Germans experienced a series of torpedo failures in the early Norwegian campaign of 1940 that caused considerable distress and resulted in formal courts of inquiry. Some failures were attributed to magnetic pistols detonating prematurely. Others were traced to depth-keeping problems. The G7E was subsequently modified, and by 1941, its reliability had improved substantially, though it was never quite as consistent as the thermal G7A in extreme cold. Nevertheless, its tactical advantage, that absolute absence of wake, made it the weapon of choice for close-range engagements against merchant shipping. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Royal Navy's opportunity to examine the G7E up close came through a combination of good fortune and the determined work of men in very dangerous circumstances. The most significant early recovery occurred in the waters around the British Isles, where damaged U-boats occasionally shed their torpedo loads before sinking, and where, on several occasions, torpedoes that had failed to detonate were recovered from beaches or from shallow water wreck sites. The full systematic exploitation of German torpedo technology, however, accelerated markedly after the capture of U-570 in August 1941, a U-boat boarded and taken intact off Iceland, whose equipment, documents and weapons provided a detailed picture of German underwater systems at a particular moment in the war's development. The engineers who examined the recovered weapons worked primarily at the Torpedo Experimental Establishment and at associated facilities connected to HMS Vernon. What they found inside a G7E was, in the account preserved in post-war technical assessments, both impressive and uncomfortable. The battery technology was sophisticated. The cells were of a type and arrangement that British engineers had considered, but not developed to this standard. The motor design was compact and well engineered. The depth-keeping mechanism was reliable, and the preheating system was practical in a way that suggested the Germans had solved a problem British engineers had identified but left unsolved when they abandoned the electric torpedo program in 1938. The comparison with British and American contemporaries is instructive and, for the British side, not entirely flattering. The American Mark 14 torpedo, which entered service with the US Navy in 1938, was a thermal weapon of the compressed air type and suffered from its own well-documented problems, running too deep, failing to detonate reliably, and, crucially, leaving the same visible wake that characterized all thermal designs. American submariners fighting in the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 lost kills they should have made because their torpedoes passed beneath Japanese warships or because their targets saw the approaching wake and turned away. The United States did not field a reliable electric torpedo until the Mark 18 in late 1943. And the Mark 18 was, in a detail that carries its own significance, reverse-engineered directly from the German G7E, using the technical intelligence gathered through captured weapons and documents. The Americans, confronted with the same evidence that British engineers had examined, made a different decision, or rather were compelled toward it, by the operational failures of their existing weapons. The British position was more complex. The Royal Navy had never entirely abandoned research into electric propulsion, but the priority accorded to it had been low throughout the early war years, and the production capacity required to develop a new torpedo type from scratch was not available in the immediate crisis of 1940 and 1941. British surface ships and submarines continued to rely on thermal torpedoes throughout most of the war, accepting the wake problem as an operational constraint to be managed rather than eliminated. It was not until later in the war that British electric torpedo development produced weapons approaching the performance of the G7E, and by that point the strategic situation in the Atlantic had been transformed by other means: radar, improved convoy organization, air cover, and the breaking of German naval codes. The actual historical impact of the G7E on the Battle of the Atlantic is genuinely difficult to disaggregate from the broader catastrophe of the shipping losses of 1940 to 1943. German U-boats sank approximately 2,779 Allied merchant ships during the war, totaling roughly 14.5 million gross registered tons. Figures that come with the caveat that attribution between torpedo types is imperfectly recorded in the surviving documentation. What can be said with confidence is that the G7E's wakeless characteristic contributed materially to the tactical success of U-boat attacks during the period when German submarine warfare was at its most effective, particularly in the night surface attacks favored by commanders like Otto Kretschmer, who operated at close range and relied on the inability of his targets to identify the point of attack. The psychological effect on Allied merchant sailors and their naval escorts was considerable. An attack that gave no warning and offered no opportunity for evasive action was qualitatively different from one that could, in principle, be seen coming. The legacy of what Royal Navy engineers found inside that torpedo extended beyond the specific weapon they were examining. It represented a case study in the consequences of institutional decision-making under uncertainty, of choosing the known performance of an existing system over the speculative potential of a new one. The British engineers who made the 1938 recommendation were not incompetent. They were working with the information available to them, applying the operational requirements of the fleet as they understood them at the time, and reaching a conclusion that was internally coherent. The problem was that the war they were preparing for was not the war that arrived. The battle they anticipated, long-range fleet engagements in open waters, was not the battle that determined the Atlantic campaign. The war came to them at night, at close quarters, against slow merchant ships, and the weapon that mattered most in that context was one they had decided not to build. Surviving examples of the G7E torpedo can be examined at several maritime museums in the United Kingdom and Germany, including the Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport, where a cross-section display allows a visitor to see the battery arrangement and motor assembly that German engineers had refined into a weapon capable of reshaping underwater warfare. They are, in their way, unremarkable objects, cylindrical, functional, stripped of drama when at rest on a museum stand. It requires some effort of historical imagination to connect the object on the stand with the cold water of the North Atlantic, with the darkened bridge of a freighter, with the silence before the explosion. On that autumn afternoon in 1942, when a British torpedo engineer first opened the casing of a recovered G7E and looked at what was inside, he would have seen the battery cells, the motor, the preheating connections, and the contra-rotating propeller assembly. He would have recognized the principle immediately, because British engineers had understood it since before the war. He would have known, with the particular clarity that hindsight forces on technical minds, that what he was looking at was not a German invention in any absolute sense. It was a German commitment, a commitment to an idea that his own service had weighed, found wanting by the standards of a war that did not happen, and set aside. The G7E was wakeless because it burned nothing. It burned nothing because it used electricity instead of fire. It used electricity because German naval engineers in the mid-1930s had looked at the same performance numbers that British engineers had looked at and reached a different conclusion about what those numbers meant in the context of the war they were likely to fight. They were right, and the advantage they derived from being right was measured not in percentages or tactical assessments, but in ships on the bottom of the ocean, in oil that did not reach its destination, in men who had no warning of what was coming. The lesson of the German electric torpedo is not that innovation always wins, or that the bold choice is always the correct one. It is something narrower and more precise. It is that the requirements you write today describe the war you expect, not necessarily the war you will get. And when the war arrives, the weapons you chose not to build cannot be quickly replaced. Britain understood the wakeless torpedo in 1938. Germany built it. By 1942, the Royal Navy was fishing the weapon out of the sea and taking it apart to understand what had been inside it all along. The principle they had known, the commitment they had not made, the ships that had paid the difference.